Who let the dogs out?
I love dogs.
I love dogs too.
Glad we're all on the same page.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Welcome to the Sarah Andreyko Show.
Dr. Greg Larson, welcome so much. Thanks for joining me on this podcast episode. I feel like this is going to be one of those episodes where you're just going to learn a whole lot of really cool stuff if you like dogs, especially when it comes to kind of the origin story of how dogs and humans became friends. Now, you're the lead researcher at the Paleo Barn at Oxford University. And so tell us a little bit about what you do over there at Oxford.
Well, we're a big group. We are within the School of Archaeology, and so I've got a lot of colleagues who do all kinds of things related to archaeological science and using a lot of really cool cutting-edge techniques to try and investigate the past. And so what we do specifically in our lab is extract and sequence DNA from things that have not been alive for quite some time. And what we mostly focus on, though not exclusively, we focus on a lot of domestic animals. And we try and understand the relationship between, and how that relationship changed between people and animals going back 20, 30,000 years.
Yeah, that's a really cool, interesting field for the most part. I also had your titles listed as Paleogenomics and Bio-Archaeology. Can you tell me a little bit about what each of those things mean?
Yeah, so paleogenomics just means that we are getting DNA sequences out of things that have been dead. So a lot of people who work in genomics tend to work mostly on modern samples. So if you take a cheek swab and send it into a company, or you get a sample from any living population, that is a kind of a modern resource that people then look at the genomes of those things. Paleogenomics simply says, can we still recover the fragmented and denatured and messed up DNA that still persists, but maybe only in very tiny fractions in things that have been sometimes dead recently, sometimes museum samples that have been dead on the scale of, say, decades to centuries, or things in archaeological and paleontological sites that go back, say, 10, 20, 50,000 years, something like that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And especially with some of the stuff that you guys are pulling and able to extract DNA from that is literally thousands and thousands and thousands of years old. So one of the things that I was going to ask you about too is kind of this timeline of what you have found. I know you have a team of something like 50 people or so that are working on some of these different projects of doing these digs and finding these remnants of all over the world. And it's really interesting. I think some of this stuff is dating back to like 30,000 years that you're finding. So can you give me a little bit of the timeline of some of the stuff that you're actually working on and able to extract some of that DNA from for comparison?
Yeah, sure. So within sort of an evolutionary timescale, our species is about, give or take, say 300,000 years old. That's kind of a number that people use, anywhere 200 to 400, something like that. So domestication, though, is only, say, the maximum, the last 10% of that. So at the very outside, you're looking at about 20 to 30,000 years of the beginnings of the relationship between humans and wolves that have led to dogs. Most of our very close relationships with other plants and animals are much more recent than that, 10 or 11 or sometimes even 5 or 6,000 years. So we're really just talking about the very small fraction of the overall time since the emergence of our species that we have been very heavily involved with and often reliant upon a suite of domestic plants and animals that we refer to domestic. And that's most of the research that we do. I do have colleagues, though, that go way back in time and have just been publishing DNA from mammoths that are like 1 million years old. And of course, what kicked this whole thing off in a big way was Michael Crichton's vision that if you could get DNA from something that was dead, why not get something out of a dinosaur, perhaps? And that goes back to at least 65 million years. But by the time you get that far back, there just isn't any DNA left anymore. Like everything else, DNA degrades through time. But if you're working with something, material that's in, say, permafrost, where it's basically like keeping it in deep storage for a long period of time, there is the opportunity that it will have survived for maybe 1 million years. But most of the time, we are feeling pretty lucky if we are able to get DNA that is even remotely worth looking at, because it's not so fragmented of material that's maybe 30 to 40,000 years old.
Gotcha. So what's some of the oldest materials that you're working with right now?
Probably at about that time frame. The other interesting thing is that direct radiocarbon dating goes back about 50 or 60,000 years. Beyond that, you have to start to use other dating methods to be able to give you some indication of just how old it is in the years before present. So, and because most of what we're interested in has to do with the relationships that people have had with other organisms, and most of those things are relatively recent, we tend to stay reasonably close to the present. So we have worked with material that's 30,000, 40,000 years, but that tends to be on the outside. And the other thing is there's just not much in the way of wolves going that far back. There are a few, and we are working with some of those, but by the closer you come to the present, generally speaking, the more available material there is, just because you get a lot more archaeology, you get a lot more remains, you get a lot more people excavating in those time periods, and that means there's a lot more material available to try and get DNA from.
Gotcha. So when it comes to domestication, this relationship between dogs and humans, what are we looking at from a timeline perspective, wherever it is around the world, where it started and how long ago we think domestication really started to occur between canines and humans?
That's a great question. And that's one of the questions we've been pursuing for a long time. We know that dogs are the first animal that emerges from this closening of a relationship between humans and some other organism, in this case, wolves. So dogs are an emergent property that is the result of a human population and a wolf population coming close enough together that you alter probably the people to some degree, but certainly the wolves to a large degree, that they become kind of interdependent and reliant on one another. And there are a couple of schools of thought about when this process began. At the very minimum, you're looking at about 15,000 years, when there is an archaeological dog at Bonn Oberkassel, which has a whole bunch of signatures that make it look very much like it was a domestic dog that we would recognize today. And at the deeper end of things, there are people who are saying maybe 30, 33,000 years ago is when it may have started, based upon some other evidence. So those tend to be the bounds that we work in. And trying to narrow down the specific time frame, because that's still a very big window of time. And so what we'd really like to do, and what we've been working on with a lot of other groups, is trying to narrow that window and get more specific, and then start asking questions as well about where did that process take place, how did that process take place, how many times independently did that process take place. We know it's first, we know it's important, we know it sets in motion a whole bunch of other things about the change in humans with respect to their relationship with the natural world. We are just struggling to really get down to that narrowly focused place and time and independence and process about how the whole thing emerged.
Yeah, that's a lot of information, a lot of data to gather over such a large period of time. I mean, I'm sure in the history of things, it's a snapshot, but as far as getting that specific, that's got to be quite the challenge. Now, one thing I want to ask you too about is that for people that don't really know, haven't really studied genetics a lot, or lineages, archaeology, and all that kind of fun stuff, I think the majority of people out there see this as kind of a straight line. So for example, you have the wolf, everything descended from the wolf. And then you have these slow formations of domestication all the way leading to the domesticated dogs and all these crazy breeds that we have formed from this one line. But I was reading something recently that you guys put out that it's actually multiple different lines. So some of these animals that were descendants of wolves or descendants of other animals that were similar to wolves actually died off and had no part of the line that actually became the domesticated dog that we now know today. Can you give me a little more information about that?
So that's a great question. It's something that we're still struggling with. About 5 years ago, we put a paper out that suggested that, or at least proffered an opinion, a hypothesis that said perhaps there were two different wolf populations that had evolved independently for some time, both of which had gone through a similar domestication pathway, as it were, leading to kind of an independent dog populations, and those dog populations later merged as the people who they were with walked around Eurasia and kind of intermingled with one another, very much like the people were doing. So then last year we put a paper out with another group where a whole lot more data, a lot more ancient dogs. And in that paper we were saying, you know what, it looks more like there was probably just a single wolf population that gave rise to dogs. And that wolf population has, if not gone completely extinct, has sort of been homogenized into a series of other things that makes it no longer distinguishable from everything else. But now we seem to have some data that is kind of undermining that a bit as well. And the pendulum keeps swinging back and forth, really, between is there more evidence in weight of a single population of wolves that's given rise to dogs, or is there enough evidence that suggests that other wolf populations were involved, either independently or because they were contributing DNA to dog populations as they moved into territories where there were unique populations of wolves. All of those things are still very much on the table, and we are very much in the process of gathering a whole lot more data to try and just increase the full amount of genomic data through time and space for us to really test those hypotheses.
Yeah, so still not really concrete evidence as to whether things were primarily from one major population, and as things split and diverged and populations grew, whether those things were had independently risen, or whether that was something that started off kind of separately with separate populations that developed over time in separate areas.
Exactly.
So yeah, I'm curious to know if the first domesticated dogs in Eurasia, for example, were related to the first dogs that we saw here over in the Americas. What those relations are between those two populations.
So yes, the answer to that one is a very clear yes. So that we have very nice evidence that the very first dogs that entered the Americas almost certainly did so with people. And well, they must have done so with people, but with the first people that were coming into the Americas, and that those dogs were related to dogs that we see in sort of northeast Siberia. And we have a really nice correspondence in the split times between the different lineages that arrived into the Americas and their coalescence, or their kind of gathering back to a single population that was in northeast Siberia. And it's the same is true with the timings of the people. There was a population in northeast Siberia that then went into the Americas and radiated from there. And all of those different movements and splittings all took place at about the same time between the humans and the dogs, which suggests really nicely that there was such a strong correspondence that almost the very first people coming in had dogs, and as the people are moving east and west and south, they're taking independent populations of dogs with them.
Yeah, that's really interesting to see how that shift of human population moving from continent to continent actually completely affects the ecology of everything. We're bringing in this whole new species and introducing that, as we humans love to do, from country to country and continent to continent. But when humans first came over, first of all, how long ago do you think that was when we first came over with domesticated dogs? And was there already a population of domesticated dogs in the Americas? And if so, what was that dynamic like? Are we looking at hybrid animals potentially giving rise to new populations? Did one species die off? Do we have any evidence to show anything like that?
So prior to about 16,000 years ago, there are no people in the Americas. There's lots of other stuff. There's lots of other amazing, fascinating things, but no human beings. So the first human beings to arrive into the Americas do so primarily, well, exclusively really, from northeast Siberia. Whether they come through on a more terrestrial continental route or whether they're following a coastal route down the west coast, or both, is still kind of a question that's up in the air, and there seems to be some pretty strong evidence for both. But it looks from our evidence that as those people are arriving, they're doing so with dogs. So if there's no people in the Americas, there's no dogs in the Americas, because dogs, again, are an emergent property that results when humans and wolves get together. So you need humans plus wolf. If you don't have either of those two components, you don't have dogs. So what's interesting, though, is that when they do bring those dogs with them, that those dogs become, in the same way that people do, sort of indigenous to the Americas. They split off from the populations that are in Siberia, and they become unique, circumscribed populations in their own right. But then, in the 16th century, when you get this big wave of Europeans coming in from the east, on the ships had both people and dogs, and both the people and the dogs replaced largely the indigenous populations of the humans and the dogs that were in the Americas through disease, through persecution, through war, through all kinds of cultural things. Like there's a whole suite of really, frankly, terrible things that happened to the indigenous populations. But the interesting thing was that it was both the people and the dogs.
Did this happen with other animals as well, or was it just the domesticated dog population that came over? Or were we looking at domesticated farm animals potentially at that point too?
So the dog was the only thing they had in common. There were other animals in the Americas that were domesticated, or at least occupied important roles within human social spheres and communities and civilizations and everything else. But none of those animals were present in Europe or in Africa or in Eurasia, and so there wasn't the same kind of replacement effect. So when people brought in horses, there were already no horses in the Americas. Although horses had evolved in the Americas and then made their way into the Eurasia, they all were extinct by the time the Europeans brought them back over again. There was no turkeys in Eurasia. There's no corn in Eurasia. There's no llamas or alpacas in Eurasia. All of these things are indigenous to the Americas. So there wasn't necessarily, they couldn't have been replaced by their kind of cousins that were on the other side. It was just the dogs that made it in with the first people, and then the dogs came in with another group of people, and those two populations then interacted to the degree to which that the Native American populations of both people and dogs really took a big nosedive.
Gotcha. That makes sense. So what about the wolf population originally in the Americas?
That's a great question. There certainly were wolves in the Americas. And although there's this interesting thing about, there's a series of different lineages of wolves, of coyotes, of red wolves, of Mexican wolves. There's lots of different lineages of what we call canids generally in the Americas, and they're interacting in sort of interesting ways. There's generally a lot of gene flow between canid lineages overall, globally. And so how different the wolves in the Americas were to the wolves in East Asia, and specifically in sort of Northeast Asia, is, through time there's a lot of mixing, because as the sea levels go down during ice ages, that exposes this area of land called Beringia, and that allows for a lot of animals to move back and forth between the Americas and Siberia. The sea levels then rise again as you get warmer temperatures and everything melts out, and that then severs that connection and making it much more difficult to cross those two places. So you can look back through time, and in like the last 3 or 4 instances in which there was this causeway, all kinds of things are moving back and forth, and that includes a lot of wolf populations too. So as it gets cut off, you get then a wolf population that ends up indigenous, especially to the northern part of the Americas, and what the kind of genetic relatedness of those are to the canids that are a bit further south, whether or not they're admixing with coyote-like creatures, and how that is impacting the wolves that are in northeast Siberia, is a big kind of, everything's kind of connected in interesting ways. And in trying to infer those differences and work out those patterns of gene flow through time is something that we're actively involved in right now as well. What's clear, though, is that the dogs that are coming in are clearly descended from the dogs in East Asia and not from the ones that were in North America.
Gotcha. So everything else is kind of slightly unknown as far as where those populations are arising from based on what could have been there at the time.
Yeah, there's a whole lot of admixture and gene flow and lots of togetherness. You're not talking really about independent lineages so much as you are lots of kissing cousins, as it were. Like everything's just sort of blending and mixing in different times and spaces, and trying to unpick all of that is much more difficult than if you have very distinct lines that are all evolving separately from one another and not interacting whatsoever.
Well, and that's interesting too. When it comes to canids, it's very interesting to see the canids that can hybrid or reproduce by interbreeding or crossbreeding rather, whereas some of them just don't, and they just kind of die off. So you see that lineage from the wolf that has kind of given rise to the domestic dog. But what about things like the foxes and the coyotes and those different canids? Why are we only seeing specifically the wolves that have kind of led to that domestication line versus some of the coyotes and the foxes? Because it was interesting. I was reading this one study about how easily you can domesticate a fox, how quickly you can do it over a series of generations, as opposed to taking like a wild wolf population and trying to domesticate them over a few generations.
Yeah. How long you got? There's a whole philosophy around this as well. I feel like that perspective about domesticating is, and a friend of mine coined this term recently, about that use of the word domestic there as a transitive verb, meaning that this is something that has a subject and object. So when we say domesticate, we mean that we as smart, intelligent, goal-directed people are going out and intentionally subjugating some animal to a process by which we're going to make it more amenable to manipulation, and we control its reproduction or whatever it is. And the more evidence that has been coming out recently just suggests that that's not how this process works. That really, when we talk about a domesticated animal, we're characterizing a suite of characters that differentiate it from something else that's more wild, which we tend to mean sort of less in connection with human societies and populations. But how that linkage occurs isn't always, or probably is rarely, if ever, something that people would just go out and do. And although there are people who have a very strong difference of opinion, and they think that dog domestication resulted from human beings 20 whatever thousand years ago going to a wolf den, grabbing a puppy, bringing it to a human camp, and subjecting it, and like petting it and trying to tame it, and then that leads to domestic dogs. Yeah, I have some issues with this. I think that's kind of a little too easy, and it's also not how anything in biology has ever worked. But there are, you can't dismiss it completely out of hand either. I mean, the hard part is to try and put together. You need a theoretical framework to then interpret the empirical results that you get from your research, and so you can have the same set of results that can be interpreted in very different ways. So thinking about foxes. People and foxes, and as you say, a variety of other canids have had interesting relationships through time. You can find fox burials in Portugal. You can find Andean foxes burials in South America. So, but simply seeing a burial or having some sort of manipulation to an organism or finding it within an archaeological context doesn't mean it was domesticated. And nor is anything easy to domesticate necessarily, nor is domesticate something that is ever a goal-directed end goal or desired result of some sort of interaction. So I think it's very easy to to simplify these processes and to think about the relationships that humans have with these animals and then ask questions. But I'm not always sure that those are the right questions, because I think very often they're fundamentally flawed in the way that they're perceiving how the whole thing got started in the first place.
Yeah,
I know
you
that's
put
not
that
really
very
saying a whole hell of a
eloquently.
lot.
No, that's great. That's really helpful, because you think about it as humans, correct? This intelligent species, we see these other animals and we find different ways that we can use them. So we have this idea that everything we have done, we have specifically done to them for those specific purposes. So I see this animal, I see a use in it that I can use for myself, and I take it in and I form it, I mold it to fit that use. And I like that you're kind of bucking that a little bit, because I'll tell you, as a behavior professional, as a behavior consultant with domesticated dogs, one of the things that I talk to people about routinely is bringing the relationship back to an actual mutual relationship. Whereas I'm not educated in this field as you are, but my theory was always that this was a mutual relationship that formed between an animal and a human. They were able to both benefit from something that was happening between the two of them in some way. And so when I talk with clients, I'm like, okay, let's think about this. You don't have a dog so that you can bark orders and you can make it do things for you. It's supposed to be a mutual relationship where both of you benefit. Otherwise, what's the point? And when you don't have that mutualism, that's where you see that imbalance, and you see a lot of those frustrating behaviors, because one of those organisms isn't having their needs met specifically.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And we use that word a lot. And there's different kinds of mutualism within biological organisms well outside of people. And you can think of all kinds of really neat analogies about birds with specific beaks that are quite long, and they get nectar from flowers that are neatly long as well. And so you get this really close symbiotic relationship between two different species. And I think that symbiosis is a much more apt metaphor to think about how these relationships get initiated, how they sustain, and then the emergent properties that result in both the people and the plant and or animal with which they're having that relationship. And as you say, if it's not benefiting one or the other at all, then that just, that's not necessarily something that's going to be sustainable. So then the question becomes, okay, well then how do you initiate, or how do these processes become initiated if it is not top down? And so there's this classic joke where it says, humans domesticated dogs, but cats domesticated us. And everyone goes, it's like,
Yeah.
but both of those are making the same mistake, which is, again, domesticate as a transitive verb, that it has to be initiated and carried out by one organism over the other one. And that there's some sort of power relationship with all of that. When really what we're probably talking about more realistically is, like anything that gets started, there's a lot of accident. There's a lot of kind of initial things that are changing in that relationship. But the point at which we're now, it's very easy to look back and say, well, that's why it was done. And take that to its logical extreme. So you can say, oh, well, we eat cows. So cows were domesticated so we could eat them, because that's what we do now. If you take that same argument, you would say, oh, well, we domesticated dogs so they could sniff out cancer in cancer patients, because that's what some dogs do now. And clearly nobody would believe that. And yet we use that same style argument to make the case that whatever its current use is, that explains its original origin. And that always kind of falls down. So rather than using current utility, as it were, or kind of thinking about what our current relationship is with dogs, and we get rid of that as a model for thinking about how it originates, now we have to start thinking outside the box about, okay, what is it that might draw these two populations together? How do they become first acclimated to one another, and then how do they become sort of maybe mutually reliant upon one another? And each of those stages is a very slow process. And think about any relationship that you have with anything else. If you meet somebody, I don't know, online or at a bar, at a supermarket, whatever, and you see them again, you're now not married. You're not in a long-term mutual relationship where you have got expectations for your behaviors or what you're going to eat at dinner or whatever else. But when you get married, you very often rewrite the history to say, oh, okay, now we have a date at which we met, and that's our anniversary, and that's the song that we heard, and everything else. You retroactively fit a narrative to make the present make sense, when in fact, when that was actually happening, you didn't know that was going to be your anniversary date, because you were dating 4 other people at the time, for which you also had first dates, right? We retrofit narratives to make the current situation seem like it was inevitable, when it never ever was for any of our relationships, whether that's with a domestic animal or another human being or some piece of furniture that you have in your house, or even if it's inanimate objects. It doesn't matter. However we inform our lives with respect to how we interact with everything in them, we are very good at making up stories, but we're very bad at telling the story that actually happened. And I think that's probably what blinds us always to trying to discuss and think about the origins of the domestic animals with which we are surrounded by and reliant upon.
Yeah, excellent points. I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, it's really interesting to think about that process and it being more of a natural process and a natural occurrence as opposed to something that we've forced into place or forced into position. And I always laugh because I think of it from a safety perspective too. Like, how did we safely integrate with these animals? I wonder how many oopses there were. I think of that really old movie, and I have no idea what the title is. I think I was a kid when it came out, but this couple out in Australia that's camping and the dingo runs off with the baby. I'll never forget that. I mean, when you think about these integrations, like how many babies did the wild dogs run off with before they were able to kind of figure this relationship out and make this work safely?
But that assumes that we
factors.
and again, I think there is an assumption that now that dogs are domesticated, we're all okay. Do you know how many dog bites there are that send people to hospital every year all over the world? And compared to how many wolf attacks there are, it's like 100 or 1,000 to 1 or even greater than that. It's ridiculous. Like, there are all kinds of accidents that we still have toddlers die every year from dog attacks, right? Like,
That's true.
This is not a thing that's been solved. This is not nor is it necessarily a problem. It's just that sometimes the circumstances in which we find these two species end in tragedy, even though we still call them domestic because we share our lives with them to such a strong degree. The other thing that we tend to discount when we refer to an animal as domestic is the variability that we see in different populations, not just in time, but in space as well. The majority of dogs on Earth are not dogs that we would think of in the way that we often do in the West, which is a companion animal that lives in your home that you feed and you take for walks. Most of them, and their estimates vary, but say 60% or so, are more like pigeons, where they hang around settlements, they hang around villages. They're tolerated, sometimes occasionally fed, but they don't have names. They're kind of sometimes taken care of, but generally ignored. So those are dogs too, and those are in some ways maybe just as domesticated, if you will. But we don't really know what we mean by this word, except for that we tend to mean what our relationship personally is with our animal, whether that's a rabbit or a chicken or a dog or whatever else, and then use that to mean the entire species writ large, even though when you look at all the individuals of that species, many of them have very, very different relationships with themselves and with people and with different cultures than they do in other places in the world.
Yeah, and interestingly enough, you bring up the different populations that don't interact with humans the same way that we think of in specific when we think of domesticated dogs, the companion living in our home with us, sharing a bed, sharing everything else, our day-to-day activities. There's actually a lot of research out there that they're putting together, and they're studying these different animals that are in these social packs outside of humans, but that interact with humans on a daily basis, like the strays in Istanbul and the Mexican street dogs and the boonies out in Guam and all these different populations that are existing and are doing just fine and actually have less issues, less illnesses. They're not stressed. They're not exhibiting frustrating behaviors. They're not trying to hurt people. They're not attacking other animals or other dogs. They just seem to have this really great balance going. It's almost as if when we take these animals out of that environment and we do force them to be companion animals, we start to see this shift of, where people just naturally anthropomorphize. And then we start creating all of these issues with these animals because we're trying to pigeonhole them into a square, that they don't necessarily naturally fit into. So it's interesting you bring up about those different separated populations. I'm really curious as to kind of how those evolved from the domesticated dogs. I'm going to use that term really loosely now, thanks to you. How those two populations have, especially geographically, because we have these street dogs all over the world, and we have these domesticated dogs in homes with people as companion animals all over the world. So it's really interesting to know the difference of how that evolutionarily, goodness, I can't speak today, I need less coffee, occurred, those divisions occurred, and what the overall impact is on the well-being of the animal that's involved versus just the human that's involved in that relationship dynamic.
And that's the issue with referring to all dogs as domestic, is that we tend to paint them with a single brush. And as you point out, there are huge differences between, and it's not just evolutionarily here. I mean, you have to take into account the socialization and the social circumstances in which these dogs, as they're born and bred with people or without people at different times in their lives, that will have a major effect about how they react to future people that they see, or other dogs that they see, or other sometimes babies versus older kids and all that kind of, I mean, everybody's got a story about their dog about like, oh, my dog doesn't like boys, or my dog doesn't like people who have bells or whatever. Like, there's always something personal about that dog that is the result not just of its genetics and its long-term history of selection and often selection for traits that are very much undermining its survivability in a context that doesn't involve people, but then even goes further about what its socialization process has been and how it grew up and in what circumstances and where it is now. And so it's like every human being on Earth. You're not going to paint all humans with the same brush. So why would we do that with our dogs?
Yeah, because it's easier. It's easier for just lump everybody in the
Well,
same
it is.
category instead of think a little bit deeper, like you said, a little bit back further in history to think about how this might have actually occurred. So I want to ask you a question because I think this is going to blow some minds because I feel like people aren't overly educated on this topic, but direwolves are a real thing. And they were, I read something recently you guys put out, actually ubiquitous to the Americas. And that was really interesting to me because I don't think, I could be wrong, that the majority of the population even knew what a direwolf was until Game of Thrones came out. So I just wanted to touch on these a little bit and talk about them, but also why they don't exist anymore. And I'm sure there's some connection to why some of the other amazing, great, large animals don't exist anymore either. But do you have information about that from your research with direwolves as to why we might not see this population in existence anymore?
Yeah, sure. And this is a paper that we just put out last year that or actually earlier this year. We've been working on it for a long time. It's hard to tell. Which was just a whole lot of fun. Because as you say, I was thrilled when Game of Thrones was out with the direwolf. I was like, oh, wow, great. This is really fun. And of course, George R. R. Martin takes the idea of a direwolf, which is, as you say, a very real organism. There were millions of them in the Americas. It was the top predator that existed from coast to coast, even in Central and South America. In fact, there's some evidence in our paper that suggests that maybe they evolved in South America before coming further north. But you only find them in the Americas. They're not anywhere else. And this was an actual organism. And if you go to the La Brea tar pits, to the museum there are thousands of skulls, thousands. I mean,
Wow.
they were just everywhere. And
How big are these? Show of hands.
the thing is, the problem with it is it looks like a wolf. And so for a long time, if you were just doing an analysis on the metrics and the shape of the skull, it bears so much resemblance to wolves, to modern day gray wolves, that a lot of people thought, well, given this similarity, they probably haven't diverged from each other very long ago. These are very closely related things, and therefore still Canis. So Canis lupus and Canis dirus. They're two sister species. So we were lucky enough that, and working with a really great team and a lot of young researchers who managed to get a number of samples from museums across the Americas. And some of those samples had sufficient DNA in them that we were able to amplify them and then screen them and sequence the genomes and compare them against all the other canids that we're talking about, both the ones in the Americas and the ones in Eurasia and Africa and all kinds of different places. And jackals and dholes and foxes and bat-eared foxes and maned wolves and the whole 9 yards. And in doing so, what we discovered was that the most recent common ancestor between direwolves and gray wolves was like 5-6 million years ago. These things aren't sister taxa. These are very, very divergent. So they look very similar. And it's this great example of convergent evolution where they take on the same appearance, but they actually don't share a common ancestor very recently at all. It's just complete sort of convergence of an idea, even though evolutionarily they're distinct from one another and have been for a long time. And so they are part of a suite of what are called megafauna, Pleistocene megafauna in the Americas that were it's just a shame that we don't have what people have referred to as a possible Pleistocene park, like Jurassic Park. But Jurassic Park, you're talking about pre-65 million years, going maybe 230, 240 million years ago. Pleistocene Park would just be like, say, 100,000 years ago to about 15,000 years ago. And in that time period, you had these things called, it's like everything that you know, but just bigger and meaner or just weirder or just some extreme version of what you know. So there are beavers the size of Volkswagen vans, right? There are short-faced bears, which are twice as big as the bears that you know now. There are sloths that are 6 to 8 feet tall. There are just phenomenally huge, weird creatures, turtles that are like just massive, like just insane versions of things that we are pretty familiar with. And included in all this, of course, was the direwolf. And we have camels, we had horses, we had all kinds of weird stuff, mastodons. And the direwolf was a top predator within this entire environment of organisms that we were to look at now. Imagine having a zoo full of these things. You would just you'd be blown away completely. It'd just be unbelievable.
Make you feel humble very quickly.
Oh, yeah. And just like, oh, my God, this is crazy because you have that beautiful, brilliant mix of like familiar and yet totally foreign all mixed up into a whole series of creatures. So, and I'm sure the direwolf would have been on appearance like just exactly the same, where you're looking at it going, this looks like I should know what it is, but I don't. It's like completely different and weird. So what happens is around starting kind of the last glacial maximum around 21,000 years ago or so, toward as the next couple of thousand years after that, you have a big ice age, and everything starts going one by one, poof, 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 poof. They all just disappear off the landscape, and the direwolf goes away too. And so, as a result of that, all we had were all of these skulls, but nobody really been able to look at the genetics of it. When we get to the genetics, we realize its distinctiveness, its evolutionary trajectory is completely different than what a lot of people were suspecting based simply on a comparison of its morphology alone. And that may be why it no longer was able to survive, because as we mentioned earlier, canids, like felids, are all very good at sharing genes between each other. You can get lineages that are quite distinct, but there's a lot of gene flow between them. There's a lot of hybridization that takes place across widely disparate things, but we couldn't find a single shred of evidence that the direwolf was able to successfully interbreed with any other canid. So lots of them are, but the direwolf, it appears to have branched off so early that it evolved a degree of distinctiveness that prevented it from having any gene flow with anything else. And there was a hypothesis there that as a result of that, it wasn't able to have the kind of genomic flexibility to survive whatever was going on during the last ice age as its entire ecosystem was collapsing around it. But everything else, all the other canids in North America did survive. So that's kind of it's an interesting thing.
Yeah, I wonder, is that survivability, you think, due to the fact that they are able to kind of interbreed with other species?
So that's the suggestion we put forward. I mean, it would be kind of hard to test that empirically because you'd have to subject it to a series of different things. But it is intriguing that the one lineage that didn't survive was the one that was distinctive enough evolutionarily that it was prevented from hybridizing with all the other extinct canids that remain extant and still doing very well. Thank you very much.
Gladly so, yes. Very happily that they are still thriving beautifully. So you said the words Jurassic Park, and that made something spark in my brain. Just doing what you do, extracting all this DNA, is there a likelihood that we're ever going to start trying to toy with bringing some of these things back to life?
So the paper that was just out a couple weeks ago about the million-year-old mammoth, prior to that, there was a horse that about 700,000 years ago. And so pushing it back a little bit further to 1 million, and that same group, I've got some good friends there, and they say that they can get maybe, something that's 1.5 million, maybe 2 million, something like that. But keep 2 million, even 2 million, which is just insane, is a very limited subset of what's available. And you have to have this deep freezer condition. You have to have something that is kept at very, very low temperatures consistently for a very long period of time. And that allows everything just to lock in and for the degradation process to slow to the point that the DNA maintains some sort of efficacy or some degree of still maintaining its structure. If you speed up that process of degradation at all, it disappears very quickly. So even if we can get to 2 million, 65 million is a much, much longer time before that. And the Earth has been through so many periods of warming that even places that were really cold 2 million years ago, if you go back to 4 or 5 million years ago, there's no place on Earth that's that cold. And so you've got this kind of hard line of just the permafrost environment that would allow you to preserve something for that long a period of time. So we get really nice fossils of dinosaurs, really nice fossils. Sometimes, in the right conditions, preserving bits that we can false color to make out colors of feathers, or to look at what their last meals, or to look inside eggs, or to do any number of things like that, which is just outstanding and completely mind-blowing, but there ain't no DNA. And there's no way we're going to be able to get any of that stuff, which is a real shame, and it's unfortunate, but that's just sort of the nature of sometimes stuff just isn't there to record anymore, so you can't go out and get it.
But even some of these earlier domesticated dogs, not that we would have a reason necessarily to bring them back, but given that that's much earlier in the process, that's much more close to where we are in modern times, what about extracting DNA from them? Would there ever be a reason or a need for that?
Well, that's what we're doing. Right, so that's precisely what we're trying to do, is find those very early dogs that look as though, from a whole bunch of different lines of evidence, that they are domestic, meaning that they have this relationship with people, and seeing what those genomes look like and compare them to the genomes that we have now. And for the most part, we're talking such limited evolutionary timeframes here that it's really not that different from modern dogs. In fact, all the ancient dogs that we've sequenced look very, very similar to modern dogs, especially with respect to things like wolves and all the other canids. So because they share such a very recent close ancestor. So the trick is to get good enough coverage genomes to try and find those distinctive parts of the genome that are telling us what kinds of things were changing early on during that process. Whether or not you'd want to try and clone one of those, I don't know why you'd want to do that, because I don't know what it would tell you more than what you could probably glean from the genome itself. But it would not be completely out of the question. I mean, with current technology, probably not, but who knows where we're going in the next couple. I mean, it's probably a bad idea to say that something is totally impossible, because 2 years from now, it probably will be, because that's just the nature of how things work. But when the DNA doesn't exist, like with dinosaurs, I'm confident saying that we're never going to get it, because it's not there to find. So you're toast.
I'm kind of
But
okay
if there is
with
DNA
that.
there,
Like, I'm a little worried
right?
about bringing animals like that into the modern world where we're not set up for that anymore, and all of a sudden, guess what? We become prey animals once again. Like, that's a really tricky business.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, the ethics around this are just, they're huge. You're massive, big theoretical and philosophical and practical and ethical arguments around all of this stuff. I mean, that's already now. People, in fact, people are cloning their dogs, right? And their cats. You can pay for a service, and if you
Yeah, I've
you
heard
really
about
like
this recently.
yeah, you really like your dog or your cat, there is a service that you can pay to try to clone it, and then you can bring it back as a puppy. Now, of course, just because it has identical DNA, like you talk to any two twins, doesn't mean that you're going to get exactly the same thing. It's so we tend to, and we are just as guilty of this as everything else. We tend to think of DNA as fate. If you have this gene, that's what you are. When in fact, as an organism, you are your genes plus your environment. And
Yes.
that environment plays a major role, especially through ontogenetic development. What kind of nutrients did you get in the womb? As soon as you were born, did somebody cut off your arm? What were you fed early on? What sort of interactions socially did you have with people? What were you exposed to in terms of your disease? At what age? There's a million things that determine who you are that go well beyond anything to do with your genome.
Yeah, I'd be really curious as to how many people clone their dogs and were actually happy with the end result, or how many of them had a dissociated relationship with the newer dog because it wasn't the old dog. You're such a product of your genetics and your environment that you can't replicate that. You can't replicate, the growth of that animal and the experiences that animal has, especially during that critical period. The first 12 weeks of their life sets them up for how they're going to behave and respond and react to everything else, for the rest of their existence. So it's really interesting. I wonder how many people that do that are truly satisfied with that process.
Or what their expectations were going in, and then how that got undermined. That's a brilliant question. I think then that's a research project you could do, because you could talk to these people and you could set up a questionnaire and you could field test it and the whole thing. So yeah, write that down.
Yeah, I'm like,
there's a film.
that might have to happen.
I think why not? Because what's that film? Is it Boys from Brazil? Where they try and recreate Hitler. So what they do is they get a boy, and then they try and grow him in. They get a dozen of young Hitlers, and they try and ensure that in the family they have to go out and kill the father at a particular age and everything, because they have to replicate all of the experiences that actual Hitler had at that particular time in his life in order for him to, because it can't just be his DNA. It's got to be all the life experiences that he accumulated in order for him to become Hitler by the end of it. That's
what a crazy movie.
Yeah, no, it's great. It's a classic film. So, but you can make that same argument for dogs, that even if you got a clone of your dog, if your dog had a scare when it was running across the street and nearly got hit by a car at 3, do you need to make sure that happens to your dog at 3 in order for it to become the dog that you knew and loved at 5 or 6? Or would you prevent it from doing so, in which case now it's going down a different trajectory because it didn't have that same informed experience during its lifetime? I don't know. It's just... Because another ethical thing, do you subject to a horrible experience just because its previous clone had that, right? I don't know.
Yes. Yeah, in my book, that's not okay. I always think about the individual organism that's directly in front of us. What's best for this individual organism? And if that's the case, chances are you're going to avoid some of the mistakes that you made with the one prior, which means you're going to have a different dog. You're going to have a different animal. So I think the advice on that would be, if you're truly considering that, definitely do it when you're not in an emotional state or near end of life with your animal, where you're going to be, make a very quick decision on that.
Exactly.
Goodness. So with all this research and all this information about kind of the origin of the domesticated dog and how humans and dogs came to be, what can all of this information tell us about our relationships, if anything at all, with our current companion animals, our current domesticated dogs?
One thing that I like to say is that there is this dog at Bonn-Oberkassel at 15,000 years ago, and it appears to have had a disease and recovered. It appears to have sort of had a skeletal issue that then healed. It is buried next to a person. It has all of these signifiers within an archaeological context that it was cared for, that it was looked after, that it had a close relationship with people that we would recognize with our own dogs. And that's 15,000 years ago, and it almost certainly went back before that. That's just our first record of one. So when we're looking at our dogs now, if you love your dog, and you can't help but not. And it's your companion animal, and it's there, and it's a member of your family, and we treat it as such, and we think it's going to heaven. And there's all of these things, really interesting social developments about the way in which we react with and interact and react with our dogs, that you can rest assured that that is something that has been going on for thousands of years, that 30 generations of your ancestors have felt very similarly about their dogs. And that's just kind of a neat connection. This is not a brand new thing. And so because of this deeper history of it, it kind of feels very much a part of our species. And that connects us to the rest of the world in a way that would be hard to conceive of or feel that much closer than if it was something that we're just as reliant upon, which is rice or maize or any number of other plants or fruits or any number of other things that our lives are just as predicated on a reliance upon them, but it's the relationship that we have with our companion animals that kind of make us who we are in an interesting way. And that goes back so far that we can feel this really neat connectedness with people who have very different life experiences in time and space across the world. And all that does is just increase empathy. You can very often connect with people over their dogs, regardless of where they're coming from or what their political or religious or cultural beliefs are, their experiences with everything else. And that's only a good thing, right? I mean, the more empathy we can have, the better off we're going to be overall. So maybe dogs are the key to that.
Yeah, they can certainly teach us a thing or two about that. the unconditional love, all that kind of things that people talk about, how much they love so much in their companion animals. It's almost like humans need to be a little bit more dog-like in that sense and learn the things that they can live in the moment, and they can, they forgive and they forget. And yeah, it's interesting that could be something that us humans could certainly absorb from them and learn as part of that mutual relationship, right?
Exactly.
Learning from our dogs. Do you have dogs? I kind of see you as the kind of person that might keep a pack of wolves, but
Ooh, that seems like a bad idea.
Yes.
I grew up with dogs and with cats and with a variety of other pets and things. I don't have a dog in my house at the moment and haven't had one for a little while, just because the nature of what I do means that pre-COVID anyway, was on the road a whole lot. And I wouldn't want to just have a dog to leave it at home for hours so that I could come and hang out with it for an hour and make me feel good about it, because I would care enough about that dog's welfare so that would be a bit problematic. But in the event that I'm spending more time at home or am able to look after one in a more kind of ethical, reasonable fashion, then absolutely. I mean, and every time somebody has a dog, I'm always approaching it. And I've got two daughters who love dogs, and every time we see one, it's also a really nice social thing, because anybody who's got a dog, then we go up and pet that dog, and now you've got a relationship or in a conversation that's starting, and you find out about that dog, and then you find out about the person, and there we go. So dogs are a great glue in that way.
It's amazing to think about how many relationships have actually formed because of dogs, because of people. Sure. Dogs make you more social in general. You have to get them out. They require activities. So you take them out and you socialize. So another interesting thought is how many people out there have actually formed the relationships that they're in, or, their best friends or their spouses, all because of interactions that they've had because of their dogs.
Aren't there whole rom-coms around this premise as well, where the guy has to get a dog and go to a dog park in order to meet people, because then it's a non-threatening way of approaching women?
The chick magnet. That's right. Everyone's always going to gravitate towards the dog for sure.
Yes.
But then I always feel bad for the dude that doesn't do enough research on what type of dog to get and what the responsibility actually looks like. It's like that deeper thinking right there.
And that leads to other interesting questions about what's happened since COVID. That the dog acquisition has gone through the roof.
Yes.
And now, as things appear to be maybe easing a little bit, fingers crossed, that are a lot of these dogs, or even people who had dogs well before COVID, the dogs have become so accustomed to having lots of people around for a long period of time, that there's the kind of abandonment issues and separation anxiety and all these sorts of things that might start to go through the roof a little bit. And people need to be aware of that, because it's not, dogs are not just passive recipients of our love. They are active members with their own mental health and everything else. So yeah, that needs some thought.
Yeah, there's a lot of mental well-being that's not necessarily thought of up front when it comes to dog ownership. We're definitely seeing a spike in separation-related problems, whether it's afraid of being isolated or afraid of being away from one specific person. We're seeing an increase in owner-related aggression from frustrating behaviors that these dogs are exhibiting. And then also, I don't know if you saw this or not, but Merck Animal Health put out a study recently that 70%, and this number blew me away, but I think, and don't quote me, I have to look it up again, but I think it was 70% of new dog owners that adopted a dog or a puppy during COVID were considering actually surrendering their dog or puppy because of behavioral issues. So when I read that, I was like, oh my gosh, the veterinarians, the trainers, the behavior professionals, we've got to get information out there. We got to get content out there. Like, we can fix these problems. Don't give up on your animals. You know, you didn't know what you were getting into necessarily. This is not a normal environment to integrate an animal into. So yeah, so many problems are arising just because of this huge shift with people being at home and, you know, this huge influx of people that have never had an animal prior now adopting and not fully understanding how to meet the needs of that animal as well, so that they're not seeing some of those problems.
Well, you've seen those bumper stickers, which is, you know, a dog is not just for Christmas. And in the UK, you're not allowed to adopt a rabbit anywhere near Easter. They have a whole moratorium on the whole thing. Yeah, for the same reason, right? And there should have been a bumper sticker that says dog is not just for COVID, you know?
Yeah. That's going to be the new hashtag that goes around.
Yeah, exactly.
Gosh. Well, as far as what you do you ever offer any type of continuing education, or do you do any lecture type style sessions, or offer any online courses or anything like that, so people can kind of learn from your experiences and a lot of this research that you're putting out there? Or is it pretty much reading the different articles that you're publishing to learn more?
Yeah, you know, there is a really big push, and which I think is very positive, for academics of every stripe to engage more as a matter of routine with people outside of academia, and how we go about doing that, what are the best ways. And there is a whole public engagement side of what Oxford does. And I've done a lot of public lectures, and I get invited to do a lot of things, podcasts and radio shows and all kinds of stuff. And that's my primary way of doing it. I haven't set up kind of a learning style channel where I've been recording lectures and making them available. Although that's not a bad idea, really. There's all kinds of ways in which we should be disseminating information about what we do on a more regular, a more accessible framework. And there is certainly with COVID as well, there's been a huge shift in that. Just recording of lectures, and just as kind of content providers, as it were, and putting a lot more stuff out there to get people hooked onto what we do. Because the currency, as you've rightly said, of most academics is the published paper. But those published papers are written with an academic audience in mind.
Yeah, and they're difficult for the general population to digest.
Yeah, so I mean, the press helps to mediate that a lot. I mean, you mentioned the Direwolves study. So we wrote an academic paper that gets into a journal. Then there's a kind of general press release that goes out to journalists. They write their individual stories. That gets translated out, and then that gets followed up with other things like talks and interviews and things where you can kind of distill some of the larger ideas, but without using the lingo and a lot of the jargon that we are often forced to use as part of academia, just for efficiency's sake, if nothing else. So yeah, I would say that. And then there's science festivals and stuff which I've done, and where we try and put together something creative about how to communicate some of the larger ideas around everything rather than individual studies that you're doing. So it's just kind of the bigger themes around, say, for instance, domestication and how it's popularly perceived, and how some of what we're doing is trying to change some of those larger things. So yeah, I mean, we have a website. Paleobarn.com with an AEO, and on there you find all of our academic papers and some sort of ideas of what we do and how we do it, and some of the people that we work with as well. It's we keep it ticking over. We've got a Twitter account as well, and it's more of a promotional thing to when we've got new stuff coming out. But yeah, we probably should be doing something with a more dedicated channel just for public outreach all the time. Of course, that requires time and energy, none of which or all of which are in very short supply in academia and probably every facet of life. But it's a brilliant idea that we need to be following up on.
Or even just, hiring a videographer to follow you guys around and have a YouTube channel, just posting what you're doing, what you're talking about, what you're going through. I feel like people would definitely consume that information. You have a really cool job. It would be fun.
Oh, I love my job. Don't get me wrong. I have a friend who's had a film crew following me around for like the last decade, and I don't know if I can think of anything worse than that. Yeah,
we love it. It's not so nice for you. You're right. Well, I really appreciate your time today. I feel like this was such a fun episode, something that people could sit back, learn something really, really cool about, and come to appreciate the animals that are in their home even more because of this process and this conversation too. So I'm going to put your website that you mentioned, Paleo Barn, in the show notes as well, so everybody can access that directly there, can read over any of the articles that you've published to learn more about some of your work, and just some more information in there about what you do, and Oxford in there also. So all of that will be available in the show notes. Thank you so very much for your time. I'm glad we were able to make this chat happen. I certainly learned a lot and got a lot of value out of it. So much appreciated.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's been a real thrill. And it's always a pleasure to have a conversation with somebody who's actively involved with dog research and knows a whole lot about stuff, and is, just the kind of general curiosity about the world, because it informs all of us, and kind of the rising tide lifts all those boats. And it's a real thrill for me too.
I couldn't agree more. Thanks so much.
Great. Thank you, Sarah.